As I was preparing for this message, I was thinking about the Feast of Tabernacles back in 1977, 41 years ago. Of course, from the comments that Mr. Avey was making, that seems like yesterday to many of us, but of course for some of you that's before you were born. And that particular feast, I traveled to Mexico to a site called Huastepec. It was just south of, still is, Huastepec is still south of Mexico City, hasn't moved. But that was where the feast was held that year. And I traveled with a group of recent ambassador graduates. There were 5 of us in the group. We had to share costs because we didn't have a lot of money. We obviously had to pay for travel expenses, but in order to be able to have an enjoyable feast, we shared a room. There were 5 of us. Nestor was originally from Colombia. Then we had Hector. He was from California. Then Ralph and Richard, and myself, of course, the 3 R's, from England. And Richard in particular was the archetypal picture of the eccentric Englishman. Is there any other kind? Well, and he was always up for some adventure, some form of exploration, some form of something to do that was exciting. And I guess that's how the British grew their empire, with people like Richard. And we had noticed as we drove to services that there was a mountain near Huastepec. And we would drive past that. And so one day Richard said, you know what? Why don't we climb that? Why don't we climb that thing? And we thought, well, we don't have any climbing equipment. We haven't planned for that. We said, look. It was actually a volcano, but it was snow-capped. And he said, well, let's just see how far we can climb before services one morning. Just go up there, go up, then come down, and then go to services. And anyway, somehow or another, he persuaded 2 others, myself and Hector, so we decided to join him. And so we got up early one morning before sunrise, and we drove over there, and we started to climb, and it was pretty mild that time of year, and I had dressed in a T-shirt, pants and a light jacket, tennis shoes, casual clothing. And, of course, we thought, well, this is a fun little thing to do, and we'll be able to tell people about it and get to services on time and so on and so forth. But, of course, as we started climbing, the mountain started getting steeper. The bottom, you don't always think about those things. And, of course, particularly males who are, teens and early 20s don't always think things through. I'm referring here to myself. And we started to realize, this is getting a little harder as we go up. And of course, then Hector and I were starting to think, well, how far should we go on this thing? This is looking to be a lot steeper, a lot harder than we thought initially. And we started to say, well, up to the next ridge. And then we'll turn back. But of course, that next ridge seemed to take forever in getting us there or having us reach it. But then we'd think, well, there's another one that's just a little bit further ahead. And we kept doing this. And it got steeper and steeper. And the sides of this volcano were actually made up of volcanic ash. This black, I shouldn't say ash, it's probably sand. This black sand, and you would take 3 steps up, the steeper it got, and you would slide 2 steps back. Particularly if you're wearing tennis shoes. So it seems like you're never going to get to where you're going. And as we kept going, of course, the temperature also kept dropping. Now you might say, well, wasn't it obvious, Reg, that if you get to the snow line, that if there is snow, that suggests that the temperature is freezing. Yeah, it's obvious when you tell me that. But as we started out, I wasn't thinking about that. And of course, no gloves. And then I started thinking about all the stories I'd read about frostbite and about amputated fingers and limbs and so on. And as I said, we were not dressed for this. Finally, we said, look, we saw the snow line, and there's a little hut there for, I guess, people who did climbing. Let's make it to that point, and then let's turn back. And finally we did. You know, this took a whole lot longer than we had planned. I was seriously fearing for my fingers and hands. I was having to stick them under my armpits just to keep them warm, or at least not from freezing up completely. And then finally we made it down. I did pick up a piece of volcanic rock, pumice stone. I kept that as a pumice stone for many, many years. We made it, by the way. We were late for services. I think we missed services. We had underestimated a whole lot of things. And we got up, that volcano is called Popocatépetl. Some of you may have heard of it. A lot of Mexicans shorten it to Popo. And it's about 18,000 feet altitude. We got up to about 14,000, which is where the snow line starts. And as I said, that was in 1977. The last time that volcano had erupted had been 1947, so 30 years had passed from the last eruption. But starting in 1994, it has begun erupting again. 1994. So since 1994, they don't allow anyone to climb it because it is still continually erupting. In fact, I checked that the last time they had a record of something erupting was December 15th. This year. It's spewing lava, ash, and rock, so people don't go climbing there anymore. But I remember being, much more in awe of what a mountain, a volcano is like after that particular experience. I'd climbed things that were less steep in the past, particularly around California, around Pasadena. And I was thinking about this, as I said, as I was preparing for today, but also because of a recent event in the news. And as I will refer to it, let me give a little background to this. It also has to do with a volcano, but this was not a volcano in Mexico or in the Americas, but a volcano in Indonesia. Back well over 100 years ago, back in 1883. 1883. Mr. Ravy, you remember that. He remembers that well. At that time, Indonesia was known as the Dutch East Indies. And as many of you know, Indonesia is made up of a bunch of islands. And there was an island, volcanic island, called Krakatoa. And on August 27th of 1883, the volcanoes on Krakatoa exploded. They blew up. 4 enormous explosions on August 27th. They were so big that some could be clearly heard over 2,000 miles away in Australia. Gives you a sense of how loud those explosions were. And nearly 3,000 miles away in Mauritius on the western side. As a result of the explosions, 2/3 of the island of Krakatoa disappeared. Pyroclastic flows, island goes into the ocean, and as we now understand, all that going to the ocean creates these huge tsunamis, and some of them reached 98 feet. And I was trying to estimate the height of this building here, and we guess it's roughly 20 feet. So if you're talking about 98, that's about 5 times the height of this building. Talk about tsunamis that height. So some estimate that between the eruptions and the tsunamis, 40,000 people were killed. Others have figures that go much, much higher. It blew up, these explosions in total blew up 2/3 of the island with a force equivalent to 13,000 times. Get that, 13,000 times the nuclear yield of the A-bomb dropped on Hiroshima. All right, so that would be like 13,000 of those. It's a huge, huge explosion. In the year following, temperatures in the Northern Hemisphere dropped over 2 degrees Fahrenheit. The whole Northern Hemisphere, world over. In fact, temperatures did not return to normal for 5 years, created spectacular red sunsets around the world, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere. In New York, There were stories of people calling for fire engines to put out the fire because of the sunsets. There was no fire. It was just so vivid it looked like there was a fire out there. That area of the world, of course, continues to be volcanic, and back in 1927, a small volcano arose from where the old Krakatoa had been. They call it Anak Krakatoa, son of Krakatoa. Anak Krakatoa. And that is a volcano that exploded December 22nd, a week ago, and created tsunamis that were produced by undersea landslides, killed over 400 people. That was just a week ago. So it's that same location. So as I said, I'd been thinking about the topic I wanted to talk about, and these things then also came to mind. So let's start by going to Matthew 17, Matthew chapter 17. And although Jesus isn't specifically talking about volcanoes, he is talking about mountains. So Matthew 17 and verse 20, Jesus tells his disciples about an issue that had to do with faith. He says, "Your faith is too small. Truly I tell you, if you have faith no bigger than a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, 'Move from here to there,' and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you." Move, the faith to move mountains. Of course, we're all familiar with this verse. Of course, I just talked about the kind of force that is required to move mountains, move volcanoes in this case. An incredible amount of force. How many of you have read of anyone actually doing this? Anyone moving a mountain, having sufficient faith to do that? Okay, whether in the present day or in the past. Now, I don't know if somebody was praying for Krakatoa to blow up or not, Somebody might say, well, that was my doing. I doubt it. But let's go to the parallel scripture about this in Mark 11, because Mark's account adds a couple of things. Let's go ahead and read that. Mark 11. And starting in verse 22, Jesus answered them, "Have faith in God. Truly I tell you, if anyone says to this mountain, 'Be lifted from your place and hurled into the sea,'" and this is kind of what happened with Krakatoa, and you can imagine the tsunamis that would be created if this happened. "But be lifted from your place and hurled into the sea, and has no inward doubts, but believes that what he says will happen, it will be done for him." It will be done for him. I took a look at the heights of mountains in Israel, the area of Israel. I told you that Mount Popo, the one I climbed to the snow line is 14,000 feet. The mountain itself is almost 18,000. We've all heard of Mount Hermon, right? Mount Hermon in Lebanon. It's about 9,000 feet. 9,000 feet high. What about other mountains? Mount Gerizim. We talked about Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. They're both at about 3,000, just under 3,000 feet. Okay, I don't know what the technical definition is between a hill and a mountain, but they're 3,000 feet. Mount Olives has a peak, Mount Scopus, which is close to 3,000 feet. Let's see, Mount Zion, also about 2,500 feet. Mount Sinai is a little higher, 7,500 feet. But they're all in that range. We certainly wouldn't call them huge mountains, but they are mountains, they are hills. But again, they're all still there. None of them has moved. I ask this because sometimes we look at the question of faith and we'll say, well, I certainly believe I have faith. So was it an issue of faith? Is Jesus just talking about faith to be able to move mountains or move volcanoes? Well, what I thought I would do was look through the book of Acts, because the book of Acts records what happened in the period immediately after Jesus is taken up, ascends to heaven. And so this is that exciting period right after his earthly ministry, and surely if there's going to be a time when we see mountains moving, this will be it. But as you look through the book of Acts, were any literal mountains moved? Is there any record of any literal mountain being moved? Well, I found none, and I don't think you will either. But I will argue that there were mountains moved in a figurative sense. And I think that's important for us to understand, because then that sheds light on how Jesus intended us to understand his words. Not so much the literal mountain moving, but the figurative sense. So let's look at a couple of examples here in Acts. Let's start in Acts 12. In Acts 12, we see or read about Peter being arrested and put in prison. And in verse 4 of Acts 12, it tells us that he was secured and put in prison under a military guard with 4 squads of 4 men each. Okay, so that's 16 altogether. Now, it doesn't say if they took shifts, took turns, but at the very least, if they were taking shifts, you had 4 men guarding him. He's also chained. So this is would be considered impossible to escape, impossible to get out. And we read in verse 6, on the very night before Herod had planned to produce him, Peter was asleep between 2 soldiers, so 2 either side of him, 1 either side of him, secured by 2 chains, and outside the door sentries kept guard over the prison. Presumably these were awake. All of these soldiers were supposed to be awake. And then an angel appears, and it tells us in verse 7 that the chains fell from his wrists, and the angel leads him out of the prison and passes, verse 10, the first guard post, then the second, then the iron gate leading out into the city, and then he shows up where all the disciples were praying, and knocks at the door. The maid Rhoda is so excited she goes in, doesn't let him in, says he's out there, and people react, verse 15, saying, "You're crazy." But she insisted that it was Peter, and then they said it must be his angel. And so Peter is miraculously released. In fact, Herod was so furious that he had all the guards executed, since somehow he believed they allowed him to escape. He took their lives in Peter's place. But certainly, any of us would consider that Peter's deliverance from surely a fate that would have meant his death, because he talks about having beheaded James. That's when he took Peter. And being delivered in such a way is certainly equivalent of moving a mountain for Peter and for the early church. And you can imagine the encouragement that the church took from the fact that their prayer of faith delivered Peter. And yet, let's go back to the book of John, immediately before Acts. John 21, the last chapter in the book of John, and read verses 18 and 19. John 21:18. "In very truth I tell you," this is Jesus talking to Peter, "when you were young you fastened your belt about you, walked where you chose, but when you're old you will stretch out your arms, and a stranger will bind you fast and carry you where you have no wish to go." And he said this to indicate the manner of death by which Peter was to glorify God. So even though we see this mountain moved for Peter in Acts 12, we also see in John 21 that there's going to come a time when the mountain will not move. Now, does that suggest that Peter lacked faith or lost faith, or his faith was diminished by the time he got old? I don't think so. I think what it's teaching us is that God will move the mountains according to his purpose. We don't always know what that purpose is. We don't always fully understand. Now, are we supposed to pray for the mountain to move? Absolutely. But there's going to come a time when the mountain doesn't move. Let's look at another example in the book of Acts, Acts 19. This time, the example of Paul in Acts 19. Acts 19, this is Paul in Ephesus on his third evangelistic journey. And we read about some powerful miracles that he wrought. Let's start in verse 11, Acts 19. And we read that God worked extraordinary miracles through Paul. Verse 12, when handkerchiefs and scarves which had been in contact with his skin were carried to the sick, they were cured of their diseases, and the evil spirits came out of them. And this is one of the inspirations that has been used for the use of anointed cloths. But here it's talking about even material that had been in contact, just physical contact with Paul was used and was a tool to heal people of disease, heal people of evil spirits. Extraordinary, powerful miracle, certainly on any level equivalent to moving a mountain. And yet, let's go to 1 Timothy chapter 5. 1 Timothy, some years later, Paul writes to Timothy, his assistant, and he gives him some health advice. He tells Timothy in 1 Timothy 5 and verse 23, stop drinking only water. In view of your frequent ailments, your frequent illnesses, take a little wine to help your digestion. So, Acts 19, we see mountains move. 1 Timothy 5, what happened? Did Paul lose faith? Was he somehow lacking in that? Let's go to 2 Timothy, next book over, chapter 4. And here he's talking about one of his assistants named Trophimus. And we read in 2 Timothy 4 and verse 20 that Erastus stayed behind at Corinth, and Trophimus I left ill at Miletus. So he had to leave someone sick. What is this? Here in Acts 19, even handkerchiefs that have been in touch with Paul's body are used to heal people, and now people he needs, people he uses as his assistants, are still ill. So again, we see this mountains move, and then mountains don't move. Now, surely Paul was praying here for Timothy and for Trophimus. There's no question of that. Let's go to 2 Corinthians. We see that Paul himself was afflicted. Paul, the one through whom we just read in Acts 19, miraculous works were performed. 2 Corinthians 12 and verse 7, he talks about a thorn in the flesh that he was given, a messenger of Satan sent to buffet me. And verse 8, 3 times I begged the Lord to rid me of it. So he begged for this mountain to be moved, to be delivered from it. But his answer was, verse 9, my grace is all you need. Power is most fully seen in weakness. I'm therefore happy to boast of my weaknesses, because then the power of Christ will rest upon me. My grace is all you need. Power is most fully seen in weakness. Now, of course, that's a concept that I think sometimes it's hard to fully not only grasp but accept. And if we turn to 1 Corinthians 10, the other aspect of what Paul is describing when he talks about the thorn in the flesh that he begged to be rid of, we all have those afflictions, those trials, those tests. And in 1 Corinthians 10:15, Paul tells us, am I in the right verse? Okay, I'm sorry, it's just a couple of verses before that. Verse 13, Paul writes, "So far you have faced no trial beyond human endurance. God keeps faith and will not let you be tested beyond your powers. But when the test comes, he will at the same time provide a way out and so enable you to endure, even as he did with Paul himself. My grace is sufficient for you." So God is the God who moves and removes mountains. We all know the story of David and Goliath. But let's just go there, and I want to highlight a few verses as we read it in 1 Samuel 17. 1 Samuel chapter 17. And the Philistines are battling the Israelites. And starting in verse 2, we read about their lines of battle. The Philistines, verse 3, occupy a position on one hill, the Israelites on another, in a valley between them. And a champion came out from the Philistines, a man named Goliath, who was over 9 feet in height. You know, if this room is about 20 feet, roughly, he'd be about half the height of this room. A pretty tall guy. I mean, I guess I would be looking at him if he was standing on the floor there where you are seated. I might be looking up, I'm not sure, but at least facing eye to eye. Pretty big guy. And then it describes his armor, how much it weighed, and then he says, he cries out to them, verse 8, "I'm the Philistine champion, you're Saul's men. Choose your man to meet me." And of course, he knows that there's no one comparable to him. If he defeats and kills me, we become your slaves. If I vanquish and kill him, you will be our slaves. Let's go down to verse 26. And this is, now David asked the men near him, "What is to be done for the man who kills the Philistine, wipes out this disgrace? And who is he? An uncircumcised Philistine to defy the armies of the living God." So David is looking at this not as a mountain that's immovable, which is the way presumably all the other soldiers were looking at him as, but he's saying this man is defying God, and God is in the business of moving mountains of man, if you will, or a man who looks like a mountain. Verse 32, drop on down. "David said to him, to Saul, 'Let no one lose heart. I shall go and fight this Philistine.'" Then Saul questions, what kind of experience or background do you have to do that? And David said to Saul, "Sir, I'm my father's shepherd. Whenever a lion or bear comes and carries off a sheep from the flock, I go out after it and attack it and rescue the victim from its jaws. Then if it turns on me, I seize it by the beard and batter it to death. I've killed lions and bears. This uncircumcised Philistine will fare no better than they. He has defied the ranks of the living God. The Lord who saved me from the lion and the bear will save me from this Philistine." And so Saul sends him on. And then in verse 48, the Philistine moves closer to attack when they face each other, and David runs. He doesn't hesitate. He doesn't walk slowly. He runs quickly to engage him. And reaching into his bag, he takes out a stone, which he slung and struck the Philistine on the forehead. And the stone sank into his head, and he fell prone on the ground. And so with sling and stone, David proved the victor, though he had no sword. And he defeated the Philistine. So clearly, this is a mountain-moving event. David slaying Goliath. And elsewhere in the Bible, we read that all the mountains in Isaiah 40 will be made low. Now, I don't think that means literally all mountains disappearing, but all the challenges, such as Goliath here, all the mountains that humans face that trouble them and beset them with evil, shall be eliminated. And if you look at the book of Revelation, we don't need to turn there, but in Revelation 6, Revelation 16, you see accounts of mountains being removed. And yet not all mountains are eliminated, because when John is taken in Revelation 21 to see the the New Jerusalem. He's taken to a very high mountain to do that. Before I wrap up, let me just comment briefly on the obverse, on the other side of the coin, if you will. Just something for us to think about, to consider. God is in that business of removing mountains according to His will, according to His purpose. I want us to think, though, about us. What do we do in life? You know, David, as we just read, and as I'm talking, I'm turning to the book of James, so you may want to turn there too, James 1. David saw the mountain, and the eye of faith said to David, this mountain can be moved. If you can take on lions and you can take on bears, and you do that with faith in God, you can take on this giant and defeat him. And I know all of us here, if we've had any kind of trial in life that we've seen as a mountain, we've prayed, and many times we have been delivered. But you know, sometimes there is a slight problem that besets us, and maybe it is a mountain of a problem for some of us. James 1:19. James advises us that everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to be angry. Now, what does this have to do with anything? Well, I wanted to mention this because sometimes we make mountains out of molehills. In life, we are all offended. We all offend one another from time to time. And sometimes those little things, instead of being slow to anger, we're quick to anger. We're quick to take offense. We're quick to create a mountain out of something that really should have remained, at best, a molehill. And don't get me started on molehills around here. But it really is insignificant. That is my point. I'm not going to turn to 2 Samuel 12. You can go there later. But 2 Samuel 12 talks about Nathan going to David and telling him a parable about a rich man who has a visitor and then a poor man who has this one lamb that the rich man takes to offer a guest instead of using any of his flock. And David reacts with righteous indignation and anger and said, such a man deserves to die, and he should compensate fourfold for what he has done. And Nathan says, yeah, you're absolutely right. And you know something else? You're that guy. You know, because very often we don't see our own flaws and faults. Our own flaws and faults we consider, even if they are mountains, we think of them as molehills. Yeah, you know, I've got my flaws, but they're little. They're molehills. They're manageable. But yours, on the other hand, yours are mountains. And we tend to do that. And I just wanted to throw that out there for us to consider that really, in life, we should consider the kinds of things that, you know, we say and do to one another that sometimes are foolish or sometimes hurtful. We should look at them more as, at worst, tiny hills, tiny molehills, and get rid of them. We can do that. We certainly can do that. And then look to God to deliver us from the real mountains, the real challenges in life that we all face.